Hey guys, thanks for joining me today. Today I'm going to show you how I painted this portrait using only 3 colors. If you haven't already, please check the description box below. It'll have a list of all the materials I used as well as my canvas prep, and you can follow me on social media to see what I'm painting on a daily basis. So I started this painting by blocking in the background first and getting it to where I wanted and let it dry completely, and then I transferred on my image. And now I'm going in with some Ivory Black and a mixture of different values to start laying in my base layers. You can see off to the right I have my 2 colors, and then I have 5 pre-mixed piles already. I've added some Galkyd Medium into each of those piles, and each one is a different value scale. This just helps the ease of when you're painting, not having to worry about mixing. You can just grab and put it on, and then you can mix intermediate colors in between those colors to get even a different range of values. So I'm not worried about a lot of the detail right now. I'm just worried about getting my values in so that I can let this layer dry and move on to the next layer. One thing you want to keep in mind when you're painting hair is that you're not going to be painting individual strands. You're going to be painting clumps of hair, and this goes for animal fur as well as human hair. So you can see when I blocked in the hair, I am just kind of putting in the general values in that area, and it starts to become more lifelike with more layers that you add to that. So now I'm working on the fabric on the girl's shirt, and one thing you want to keep in mind when you're doing fabric is you're going to pay close attention to where your highlights are hitting and where your shadows are hitting, and that's what creates all those different folds in the fabric. Most of her shirt was already in shadow, and so it made it somewhat easy to kind of pop up those highlights a little bit and give it the right form. So when I'm making skin tones like this, trying to create the skin texture, I'm laying down the color, and then I am just kind of blocks of the grays that I used, and then I take a blender brush and kind of blend it all out. Then you can go back through and start adjusting your values even more. And I'm going to do the same process on the hand. I'm just putting in the general outline of where the shadows and highlights go, and then I merge the two. And to merge them, I usually take a clean, dry brush, and that helps with the blending, so you're not depositing any more color. And I'm starting off this portrait using the Ivory Black and White, which Ivory Black is a warm color. So when you lift it, it becomes, when you add white to it, it becomes almost like a brown, but a really faint brown. And then you'll see I go in with the Mars Black, which is a cool black, and that will give it a nice diversity to the painting, so you've got the warm and the cools. So you can see I just put the color in the general areas, and now I go back through and start blending it and merging it all together. And that creates the soft skin texture. And when I'm blending, I make sure I start with my lightest value first so that the dark doesn't overtake the light. And the more layers I do on this painting, the more it's going to push the values even more. And if you're struggling with values, I definitely suggest trying a grayscale painting. It will really help it will really help you kind of be able to visualize what is really dark and where are the halftones at. It's a really great practice to get into. So now it looks like I'm adding detail to the hair. I'm really not, because I'm going to be adding a lot more layers to this. So I wanted to make sure I put those in so that I can put more stuff on top of it. And it helps just map everything out and make sure I have the shape correct and my values correct. And I did use a liner brush for some of those wispy hairs, and I added a little bit of my Gamsol to that, just a little, to help it flow better. So now I'm working my way to the right, so that way I have somewhere to rest my hand. I start from the left of the painting and work my way to the right. Just paying attention to the highlights and the shadows, mapping those all in and blending them all together. It was really difficult to see any detail in this ear, so I kind of had to make some up. And if you're having issues with the contrast on your reference photo, what you can do is lighten the brightness in the photo on your phone app or anything like that, and that will help you see some of the detail and the shapes within those dark areas. And that's what I ended up doing for the ear in the darker areas that I couldn't see in my original reference photo. And I'm using very thin layers of paint and just kind of spreading it out, because I want this layer to dry fairly quickly so that I can move on to the next layer the next day. It does have the Galkyd Medium mixed in with it, so it will dry fast anyways, but the thicker the paint, the more difficult it's going to be to dry, and it could cause tacking issues. So I just like to apply a thin coat in the very beginning. Now the eye I struggled with a lot. It was very dark in my reference photo, like I mentioned, like the ear, and I had to try to make up a lot of the details so that it would make sense. So the eye isn't an exact representation, and it looks a little rough in the beginning and not quite accurate, but I do work on that towards the end of the painting. So you can see I'm just blocking in all of my shadow areas, and then I go back through with the lighter color and start applying that, and then you can see I go through and merge the two. And that's generally how I paint when I paint with oils, especially something like a pet portrait or a human portrait. It seems to be the easiest way to get the best blended effect. And I'm working on an oil primed linen canvas, and this is probably the third one that I've worked on, and I hadn't had any issues with any of the previous ones. However, this one didn't want, at a certain point, it didn't want to accept any more of the paint without pulling some of the other layers on. It could have been the process of just trying to paint too quickly and not letting it dry properly in between. That could have been part of the issue. Or it could be a defect in the canvas itself, but it ended up working out towards the end. I did let it dry for about 3 days and then was able to go back over it after that and clean up some of the areas where it had pulled some of the paint off. Still pushing my values, making sure it gets to the point that I'm comfortable letting it dry to move on to the next day. So now this is the next day, and I'm using the cooler tones now. So I have Mars Black and white, and I've made puddles of paint using that. And Mars Black is a very deep color, and it's definitely darker than Ivory Black. Plus, having a layer of the dark shadows already down helps make it even more intense. And that's what I'm really going for. When you're painting grayscale, you really want that intensity, those brights and those darks. So you can see how much cooler those colors are than the previous ones we used. And when I go to fill in her face with a second layer, you'll see how much more blue it is. And I end up going back over that with some Ivory Black and kind of toning down some areas. But having those cool and warm tones is what really helps a grayscale painting. Still building up all of the detail, blocking in all of those dark areas that I see, making sure I'm not painting individual strands. There are some that I do paint individual strands, but that's after I've already blocked in all of my highlights and shadows for the hair. And for most of the hair, besides the fine details that I did, I used a small flat brush, and that seemed to really yield really good results for me. But use whatever brush you're comfortable with. So this really shows you the difference between the Mars Black combination and the Ivory Black and how much more intense it is. And I'm not using straight black. It looks on my palette as it's straight black, but it does have a little bit of white mixed in with it, just so that I can reserve the darkest black and the brightest white. I reserve those for the end. So now I'm just using a small round brush and kind of blending everything, pushing the values on the arm a little bit more, adding some cooler tones in those shadow areas. And when you're blending, you don't have to have a blending brush. If for larger areas it might be useful, but you really just need a smaller brush or the similar size brush to what you're applying the paint with. And then you can just make sure it's dry, doesn't have any paint in it, and use that to blend. And that helps you blend in those really small areas. Just building up my details, making sure I get some of those images that are on her shirt, get some of those put in. And I'm not using white for that. I'm using one of the gray mixtures. The ones that are in shadow more are going to be a darker gray, and the ones that are in the bright light are going to be the lighter color. And you can see I apply the brightest color first in this scenario, and that's so that it doesn't get overridden by the darks. And I don't have to clean my brush, especially if I'm going really dark. I would want to use a clean brush or clean my brush prior, just so it doesn't, you know, dilute the paint any. But if you start with your brightest brights, you're going to be able to reserve those. And then when you blend from the lightest area into the darkest with a very, very light hand. You can see how much cooler her face is now. And that's okay for the second layer, because I do end up going in and warming it up a bit in some areas. But because her face is primarily in shadow, having that cool tone there kind of gives it a realistic illusion. You could do this entire painting in just one tone of black. If you were going to do it in just black and white, I would suggest probably Ivory Black, unless you were wanting a bluish hue to most of your things. Ivory Black is a really good grayscale color. It has a lot of brown in it, so I would suggest using that. If you didn't want to incorporate any of the cooler blacks, use Ivory Black instead. Using the liner brush, making sure I add my Gamsol to that to thin it out. Whenever you're using a liner brush, you want to make sure it's nice and thin so that it flows off the brush easier and you get really fine lines that way. These little details add a lot of realism to your paintings. When you add these final, you know, really thin strands of hair, wispy hairs, it really adds realism without having to put in a bunch of detail. So as long as you've got your values mapped out and your basic shapes in the hair mapped out, then you can go through and just start adding in a few of the wispy hairs. A lot of painting and just my style in general is a lot of push and pull. I'm constantly pushing my values and adjusting them. It's a lot of back and forth working. I don't think I've ever done a painting where I finish one complete area at a time. It's always a rework of everything all together. That's what works best for me, but if it's easier for you to work in sections and complete one section of the painting at a time, then by all means try it, do it that way. Whatever works for you. This is just how it tends to work out for me. Now I do start from left to right when I'm oil painting, primarily so that I don't smudge the painting with my palm, because I usually just like to rest my palm on the canvas while I'm working. But if you have a maul stick and want to jump around the painting like that, that would work too. Now there was a lot of fur texture or hair texture on the horse. I chose not to incorporate a ton of that. You could make it super realistic and really make sure you've got layers and layers of hair in there. I just wanted to give it the illusion that there was detail. And so you'll see in later layers that I do add some of the hair texture, but I kind of blend a lot of it out just to give some areas illusion of hair. But if you wanted it really hyper realistic, you would want to go and and paint the majority of the hair. Now here I'm trying to rework the shape of the eye. And like I said before, it really caused me some issues trying to work with it and not being able to see any of the details since the eye was mainly in shadow. So I had to make a lot of it up, but towards the end I was happy with the way it came out. So this is the area of the painting that caused me issues because of the canvas texture. I don't know if it was a defect in the canvas or if it was my application that caused issues, but on the cheek areas where it didn't want to accept any more paint in the next layer. So I was able to put this layer on somewhat easily, but the next layer it did not want to accept any more paint and was actually pulling the paint off to the canvas. Which makes me think, because I've used 2 of the other canvases that are like this, makes me think it was my application and just not being patient and letting the underlayer dry completely before I moved on. So if you're going to do this, make sure that your layers are dry. At least 2 days maybe would probably be best if you have the time. Again, just pushing my values even more, making sure that before I let this dry, I'm happy with it and am prepared for the next stage. So I do have off to the right, that's not on camera, I have a mixture of all of my warmer tones using the Ivory Black, and I'm now starting to go in and apply some of that and start warming things up a little bit more. And I'm using it almost as a glaze. The underneath layer has already dried, and I'm using it almost as a glaze, like a dry brushing technique. I'm not adding any medium to it, but I'm using a really thin layer and just scrubbing it in and kind of toning back some of those bluish areas. So now I'm going in again and adding in another layer, and this is done from here on out, except for the very, very end. Here on out is using the Ivory Black, and you can see how much warmer, even in the hair, how much warmer that is. So now I'm going in and kind of working on my transition areas to kind of soften some of the folds in the fabric a little bit more. And with each layer you do, your previous layer does show up a little bit, and that's why I like to work in layers. There's a technique called wet on wet, and that's where you do the painting all in one sitting, and I don't like the results of that when I paint it. So that's why I like to work in layers, and it helps bring out and achieve even more detail. So now I'm starting to go in and really pay close attention to the shadow areas in the face and put in a suggestion of some hair detail. And whenever you're painting an animal, you want to make sure you're following the way that the hair is laying, the way that it's growing. You want to make sure your strokes are in that direction. I'm just adding a little bit more detail inside the ear. I didn't want it to draw your eye into that too much, but just want to give it the illusion that there's something going on inside that dark area. And this is the time in the painting where you really tighten up on your brush and take things a little bit slower, making sure you're cleaning up all of your lines and really paying attention to a lot of the smaller details at this point. So the first layer, you can usually just block it in rather loosely, and then with each consecutive layer you want to make sure you're tightening up a little bit more and refining a little bit more. So now I'm using a fan brush, and I have put in my paint a little bit of the Gamsol to thin it down a little bit, and this just allows me to get a different kind of fur texture. So this is, I'm just adding in small amounts of little lines using the fan brush. And what I've done with the fan brush, instead of making it a sharp brush end, I have pushed down on the brush and made the bristles kind of fray out a little bit, and that gives it doesn't give it quite such a structured stroke when you use it. And then I go back through with a blender brush and start blending out certain areas, and you'll see some of the areas still maintain some of the strokes, and then some are blended, and that's the look I'm wanting to achieve. And I'm repeating the process with the lighter color using a small flat brush. Just putting in suggestions of some of the highlighted areas and hair strokes. And going in with a clean brush again and start blending it out. And it really is just a process of laying it down, blending out some, laying down another layer, blending it out, until you get to those final layers where you're blending less and leaving more of the details show through. At least that's the process that works for me. So now I'm just putting in some of the shadow shapes that I see that her hair is causing. I wanted them to be pretty faint, so I'm actually not using a very dark color, but I am making sure I apply it and then blend it out to soften everything up. So this is the layer on the cheek that caused me issues, and you might, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it on camera or not, but off to the very right of the cheek is where it started lifting up color when I would apply some of the dark. And that's why it's important to make sure that your layers are dry underneath, because oil is kind of like acrylics where you don't want to mess with it during its drying stages. You kind of just want to let it dry completely and then work your next layer on top of that. I'm now using a rake brush that I've thinned the paint down with some Gamsol again. And this just adds another layer of texture to the painting. And then blend it out again. And I repeat the process with the highlights as well. And again, this just leaves an illusion of hair texture in there. I blend most of it out, but leave some, and that's generally how I like to paint it. I don't necessarily want to go in and paint every single hair that I see. So just giving the illusion helps to keep the realism without having to tediously paint everything in. Upping my values even more. This is kind of the layer where it's just a process of refinement. I'm just pushing my values, especially with the grayscale painting. You really want those really dark darks and those really light lights. That kind of adds a drama effect to the painting. And so this layer, that's pretty much what this layer is a lot of push and pull. I hope that you guys try a grayscale painting, especially just if it's just for practice. This one, I've never painted a human portrait before. I had started one and never finished it. And so with this being in grayscale, it made it a little less scary for me to try, and I'm happy I did because it really helped me advance some of my value skills. And so I suggest that even if you're a really seasoned artist, you give it a try. And like the grayscale is really fun to do. Actually, you're not having to worry about too many colors, which makes it really nice. And I hope you guys are enjoying these videos. I used to do a lot of real-time videos. If you guys prefer me to do some of those, let me know. Next week I am going to be doing an acrylic painting and do a few of those. And yeah, if you guys want me to do a real-time painting, let me know and I can start producing some of those. If you have any feedback on any of the videos or any topics that you may want me to discuss or go over, put them in the comments below. I would really appreciate any feedback. I'm just adding all of the final details now. And this is the final little bit that I do. I decided after getting some feedback on Facebook that I needed to put a little bit of motion into the ground in between the horse and the girl. So that's all I'm doing right here. Making it very smudgy, very blurred. I don't want it to draw any attention. Then I'm going to go ahead and add my signature, and that completes the painting. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comment box below, and I look forward to the next video. We'll see you next week.